Hi there, Alex. Thanks so much for joining us. We were talking just before we started, whether we should actually call this breakfast or brunch with Alex Vitale, because it's still relatively early in the morning for you. So I really appreciate you being able to join us.
My pleasure.
Alex Vitale is the author of the best-selling End of Policing. Here we go. There's my copy, which I read a few years ago when it first came out. And as Alex was just explaining before we started, there's a second edition out. So we might have a chance just towards the end of this discussion to talk about that. And The End of Policing was described by the Nation as a compelling digest of the dynamics of crime and law enforcement. It was also denounced on the floor of the House of Congress as a thoroughly disreputable read, and more on that maybe when we get to it. Alex is also the Professor of Sociology and Coordinator of Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College, and I don't know if is it CUNY, is it CUNY Graduate Centre, and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. And what we're going to be covering today really is as we've done with previous lunches, with a kind of a broad sweep. So we're certainly going to be talking about Alex's more recent work around policing, but we also want to talk about where he started, some of his early work in San Francisco on issues around homelessness, for example, some of the other work he's been doing in New York and elsewhere, and also discussing some of the current issues in policing. Now, remember, we have the Q&A function, which you can use if you'd like Alex to offer his thoughts or answer a question. Please use the Q&A function. The chat function is disabled, but you can use the Q&A function. Get your questions in early if you can, because the longer you leave it, the less likely it will be to get picked up. But you can also use the upvote function. So if you see a question that you'd be particularly interested in hearing Alex's views on, then you can give it a thumbs up, and that will again make it more likely that we will be able to introduce that question into the discussion. But without further ado, let's get straight into it. So Alex, you published The End of Policing in 2017, and I think it's fair to say it became a significant bestseller and a very significant book, not just in the States, but actually certainly in the UK and no doubt in other jurisdictions as well. What kind of prompted you to write that book?
Yeah, no one expected the kind of impact that it's had. I actually had the deal to write the book before even Ferguson had happened. And I thought, well, this would be an intervention really in the conversations about mass incarceration, which had grown significantly in prominence, everything from Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow to much more critical works like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's book and so many others. And I was teaching these books, and my concern was that there was really nothing in them about policing. And policing was the area that I had been working in primarily, though I had been active in campaigns to roll back, excessive drug law sentencing and other kinds of struggles more directly tied to incarceration. But I really felt like what was needed was an intervention in the role of policing in driving mass incarceration, and also a kind of an opportunity to explore the kind of abolitionist frameworks and thinking that were becoming more prominent in the discussions around policing, prisons, and applying them concretely to policing. The other motivation, I think, was a kind of deep frustration with the discourse around police reform. I had experienced, decades of these intermittent moments of kind of explosive protest around abusive, violent, deadly policing, and I saw a certain pattern, which was this would happen in a particular city where folks were not involved in long-term organizing around these issues. So they came up with a set of demands on the fly that were often, some accountability for the officer and some like retraining or diversification of the police or more better police community relations that I felt were basically useless. And as a police scholar, I felt the literature made clear they were pretty useless. or at best, marginally effective at addressing some very particular issue. Okay, maybe we can reduce the number of chokeholds by 7%, but that's not really getting at the much larger problem here. So those were the two big motivations for me, was trying to bring abolitionist thinking into the area of policing in relation to mass incarceration, and trying to also develop a critique and alternative approach to these episodic outbursts of protests around abusive policing.
Mm. And on the, I mean, it's actually on the front cover of the original, I don't know whether it's on your new edition, says the problem is not police training, police diversity, or police methods. The problem is policing itself. So just to clarify, I mean, is your position that, training, work around diversity, those kinds of things, are just a complete waste of time and shouldn't even be tried? Or is it more those, there may or may be arguments to do all of those things, but it's scratching the surface if the issue is about addressing, fundamental problems in policing? They're kind of, as it were, the icing on the cake, or the varnish, or whatever it is, but not really the fundamental issue. Is that?
I think that movements trying to reduce the burden of policing on communities should not expend any political capital in demanding those things. What we see typically is that when policing faces a legitimacy crisis of their own making, that is what they will do on their own. They will offer up, oh, we're going to do this training. They will offer up, oh, we're going to do this new community policing initiative. Okay, you let them worry about that. They're going to try to restore their public image in a whole set of ways that don't do anything, in my opinion, to address the larger issues. So let them, but we should not be calling for that. We should be calling for reducing the scope of policing, reducing the power of policing, and replacing it with better, more evidence-based, more effective kinds of non-coercive, non-punitive interventions.
And tactically, for you, does that mean that, if the police are saying, yes, we're investing in recruiting, let's say, more, Black officers to be more representative of the community, from a tactical point of view, should activists be sort of, as it were, welcoming, but saying, well, that's not really the issue? Should they just be dismissing it as a stunt? Is it more just a question of, nah, whatever?
I think it depends a little bit on exactly what we're talking about. If we're talking about more money for more technology, more training, building a new police academy, then I think we should be against it. I think if it's for training that we know doesn't work, and it's like more money for implicit bias training, more money for, well, that stuff doesn't work. Even the police department's own internal evaluations that we've seen show that it doesn't work. And more importantly, it is intended to divert attention from the real issues. It is a way of giving the appearance of doing something without actually doing anything. And implicit bias is really the worst offender, right? Because it's a wonderful liberal kind of solution that says, well, no one did anything on purpose. It's all accidental, unconscious, and we're going to ask police officers to please quit shooting so many Black people, and then everything will be fine, and you can just let us go back to waging the war on drugs.
Okay, no, thank you. That's really that's really interesting, and I think that really helps to clarify, some of the questions at stake. We're going to be talking more about the end of policing and some of the current challenges facing policing today. But before we do, let's go back. Let's go back in time. Indeed, you, in the early 1990s, you were working in San Francisco on housing and civil rights issues. And then coming out of that, you then went to New York to do your studies, which culminated in your doctorate in sociology in 2001, I think it was. Just tell us a little bit about, what drew you to that work in San Francisco, and the kind of, as it were, the path that then took you to New York to do your studies.
And I tell this story in the new edition of the book, in the preface to the new edition, because I had so many questions, and I think it's important to kind of lay out what different career paths could look like. So I had, as an undergraduate, I didn't study policing, criminal justice at all, really. I think I had one like anthropology of law class, sociology of law, anthropology of law class. I was interested in urban development, housing policy, economic development policy, global cities kind of stuff. And that's what I wanted to do. I was interested in urban ethnography. And I went to California in the late 80s and started getting involved in these issues, and eventually got a job at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness, as you mentioned, doing housing policy, developing extremely low income and no income housing policies. I sat on task forces and things like that. And I was also looking at public spending for the kinds of social services that would benefit folks who are unhoused, marginally housed, insecurely housed, et cetera. So working in coalition with community-based organizations, labor unions that represented people who provided these services, and trying to push for more progressive taxation policy and better social spending on these issues. But it was during this period in the early 90s when we begin to see the uptick of really police harassment of homeless folks. Basically, cities like San Francisco and many others, they gave up on the idea that they were actually going to house this population. And the problem is growing, and the ideologies of austerity, budget cuts, were so entrenched that the idea that they were somehow going to raise the money to produce the kind of social housing that would be necessary to address this became politically untenable, even in the most progressive cities in the US. So increasingly, they turned the problem over to the police. And so I was asked to look into this by my boss at the time. And what became clear pretty quickly to me was exactly this connection, that what we saw was when there's a public policy failure, policing is often used to paper over the consequences. And I think this is super important that we see too much of the research around policing is endogenous to policing. It's like the police of the subject, police effectiveness is measured in policing terms, right? And as someone who came at this as an urbanist, I'm like, well, policing is just one of many tools the state can use to address problems. Why would you choose policing over other tools? And that got me to think more critically about, well, really, what is the unique function of policing? What do we need that institution for? And what does it signal when we choose policing over other potential interventions?
And was it the case then that you were saying that it was at the time you were in San Francisco when sort of policing strategies were really starting to ramp up, and there was a sense maybe they'd sort of given up on trying to solve the problem of homelessness and house people. Was there a period prior to that when they were kind of doing that quite well? And I mean, was this a result of sort of, the Reagan years and all of that? Or has it always been a problem, and it's just that the police are although the ramping up of the police was just the latest attempt to solve the problem, as it were?
So, police have always been involved in the lives of unhoused people, but the nature and extent of the problem has changed pretty radically over time. So really in the States, before the mid 80s, homelessness was really confined to a handful of Skid Row districts. And even then, many of these folks were not literally sleeping on the street. They were sleeping in SROs, single room occupancy hotels, and other kinds of, very low income, low quality, sometimes horrible conditions, but they weren't actually sleeping on the streets. But we get this explosion in mass homelessness that ramps up throughout the 80s that's tied to the destruction of those SROs and the conversion of that space into market rate and luxury hotels, housing, commercial development, right? And we have this increasing polarization of urban labor markets that are producing these people with very low or no incomes. And we have the hollowing out of the welfare state. right? We have the dialing back of welfare provisions, food stamps, restrictions on Social Security benefits for people with disabilities, et cetera. So it and the defunding of mental health services, the closing down of state hospitals without the investments in community-based supports for people that were promised. So this all just comes together as a perfect storm. And initially, cities are trying to manage the problem. They're trying to create some shelters. They're trying to create some pathways to apartments for homeless families or whatever. But by the end of the 80s, the problem has become so overwhelming and the politics of austerity so entrenched that it becomes a major public order problem, right? You have homeless encampments, you have people panhandling everywhere. And so then it is reframed not as a housing crisis, but as a public order crisis. And this is where the broken windows theory comes into play. Right, so the broken windows theory is developed in '82, but is largely ignored, right? It was in the Atlantic. It was not in a peer-reviewed journal. It was not really, did not get incorporated into sort of criminological research as a valid theoretical framework. It gets adopted for political purposes by these municipal administrations as a ex post facto justification for using police to manage homelessness as a quality of life and public order problem. So it's when the Manhattan Institute and other deeply conservative think tanks go and sell this idea to mayors saying, here's a justification for turning homelessness into a criminal justice problem.
So you've sort of got this kind of convergence really of some, material facts. There were homeless people, and probably, I'm sure, a number of people in San Francisco and other cities at times did find them disruptive and nuisance, if only because
absolutely
made the area look, to make it look nice. So you had a kind of a real material issue, which was obviously itself overdetermined by a number of political and economic and other changes, and then a particular ideology which presented the solution, as it were, but only one of a number of potential solutions. But it was the one that became, popular and got picked up. As you say, and I think George Kelling, he was one of the authors, wasn't he, of the book? They weren't were they criminologists, or were they?
So Kelling was, and James Q. Wilson too. Ostensibly, they had training, but they came out of these very conservative, really urban circles, right? So they were influenced by neoliberal economics. They came out of the University of Chicago, where Milton Friedman was, and also some of the most conservative urbanists like Edward Banfield, who were big believers in the culture of poverty. Banfield, who I believe was James Q. Wilson's dissertation advisor, something like that. Banfield was going around saying, look, we should not be investing money in poor people. If we give them a library, they'll just vandalize it. Cities are just falling apart and we should let them go. So some of this stuff was just racist, on its face. And that was the milieu that this broken windows theory came out of. And we now know that the research was faked, that the underlying idea about, if you leave a car with a broken window, it'll get vandalized. This research was faked. There's now published research that shows that that's not actually what happened. And the whole thing was politically driven, and it was never subjected to peer review.
Interesting. We're getting a few sort of questions coming in. Let's just pick up on one of them from Tobias Kammersgaard. And we might come back to some of the broader themes here, but to what extent would you say that your analysis of policing is general or abstract? And to what extent is it specific to the US context? For example, could incremental police reform potentially be appropriate in some countries where policing might not be as much in a state of crisis as it is in the US? What's your thoughts about that?
So, you know, I was familiar with policing internationally. I've lived in Asia. I've worked with police forces internationally and also human rights groups. So I don't have a uniquely U.S. centered perspective on this, but the book is written about U.S. policing pretty specifically, though there are lots of examples of other places. So when it first came out, and I was doing a lot of traveling in the UK and meeting with both police officials and giving public lectures, I was a bit agnostic. While I had done some ride-alongs and read some of the literature on British policing, I didn't feel a real expertise about it. And I know there are important differences, like carrying guns, which is now they're all getting tasers, it sounds like, which is, I think, a problematic development. Anyway, I said, well, if the shoe fits, wear it. But I think it's increasingly clear that the shoe is fitting, and fitting more now than when the book came out. And what we see, not just in the UK, but across Europe, is the growing extent to which problems of austerity are producing social problems in the communities that are being labeled public order and crime problems and increasingly being turned over to the police. We see this with things like the labeling of things as like vulnerable populations, unhoused people, protecting children, stuff around sex work, people having a mental health crisis. But these are social problems, and policing is the entirely wrong tool for addressing these problems. There are inherent problems with using policing in these arenas. And I feel like my book makes a pretty compelling case for why that is so. And interestingly, when I met with police officials in the period 4 or 5 years ago, they were all like, it's so great that we don't have to deal with those things because we agree with you. And now increasingly they do. They're doing mental health calls more. They're dealing with unhoused people more. They're seeing their presence in schools increase. It's mission creep into all the things that I was trying to wave people off of. And I'll also just say, the book is now out in about 6 languages, some in Asia, some in Europe, some in Latin America. And, what I'm finding in feedback from people is that, these are increasingly universal problems. There are differences, but there are also very strong similarities.
I mean, there are obviously, as you say, there are local differences, but whether you're talking about police or prisons or teaching or medical work, there are some commonalities across all jurisdictions, aren't there? There's a question here also from Greg from the Traveller Movement. So the Traveller Movement is one of the groupings that does work around sort of Gypsy and Romany groupings. On the recent piece of legislation that's just become law here, the Police Crime Sentencing and Court Bill, and Greg points out that it confers a legal obligation on NHS boards to share confidential information with police forces above and beyond existing public interest grounds, and clinical bodies have serious concerns. Have there been any sort of similar issues in the States about that kind of thing?
Well, we have a huge one, which is when the Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1994 as part of the Omnibus Crime Control Act that President Clinton passes, which has become known as, the 94 crime bill. Everyone said this is going to be a great advance for the well-being of women in American society because it's going to professionalize what had been basically community-based and informal movements to create domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers, and these things. But one of the conditions of that professionalization was that these institutions now had to be integrated into the criminal legal system. Duties to report were created, information sharing was required, an emphasis on getting, orders of protection through the court system, getting people to report things as a crime, as a condition for getting assistance. And the consensus, well, I wouldn't say consensus, but there's a growing body of people who are part of that movement, who've been in that world for decades, who say that this has been a terrible failure, that levels of violence against women have not improved relative to overall crime rates, that it actually has produced less reporting by women, and there's just avoidance of that whole system. And I recommend Lee Goodmark's book, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence. She spent 20 years helping women get these orders of protection, training law students in this work. And she says women are not being helped by having that system integrated into the criminal legal system.
So there's a question here from anonymous attendee, very respectful of people who want to maintain anonymity. There's all sorts of reasons why they may wish to. Given the use of violence, particularly by adult men against women and children and amongst men, is there any role for a police service that can support communities to develop and find safe, reliable and transparent systems for intervention and support? Sexualized violence occurs with and without austerity. And I guess that goes to kind of one of the nub of the dilemmas around policing, isn't it? Because most people can probably think of an occasion when they are glad to see a police officer. Not all, but most people are okay. Likewise, most of us can think of an occasion when we'd really rather not see one. So is there a role for the police service at all in these situations?
Yeah. So a couple things. First, I want to just most highly recommend Derica Purnell's book, Becoming Abolitionists. This is a woman who grew up with a lot of violence and poverty in her life and managed to, get a law degree and become a civil rights lawyer, and has written about the ways in which, especially for Black women in the United States, involving the police in their lives, even as a kind of emergency tool of last resort, is so problematic that the vast majority of these women just never call the police, no matter what happens. So the other thing to think about here is that in the absence of anything else, some people are going to call the police, right? If the choice is between policing and nothing, some people are going to feel the need to call the police. Though with what we find with domestic violence is that the vast majority of people don't. Even when serious violence is involved, people don't call because they don't trust that system. Now, I don't know exactly what the figures are in the UK. I'm speaking specifically about the US. But so what do we do in a situation like this, right? So we have to start thinking more holistically. What kinds of interventions could we do that would help meaningfully move the needle on improving the overall welfare and social condition and safety of women in society? And if we take that approach and we kind of put everything on the table as a possibility, and we start talking about what are the kinds of short and long-term changes, what are the interpersonal and structural changes, policing falls to the bottom of the list pretty quickly. Right? Policing makes sense only when we failed at every other level. And then we need some crisis response because we've allowed these crises to develop. And then even then, most people won't use it. So let's stop investing our energy in trying to figure out how to incrementally, hypothetically, slightly improve the police role, and let's start pursuing the other 99 things on the list that actually, I think, have much more promise, but just require a completely different mindset about the problem. I'll just finish by saying, if we think about the institutions in our societies that are most rooted in patriarchy and misogyny, policing has historically been the biggest defender of those institutions. So why would we invest our hopes in an institution, policing, that has been one of the biggest proponents of patriarchy or defenders or bulwarks of these patriarchal institutions? So I think we got to really think this through much more clearly. And again, Derica's book, Becoming Abolitionists, is incredibly insightful on this.
Yes, I've got a copy. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it does look fascinating. And there's actually a question here. Can we just have the author again? So that's Derica Purnell, Becoming Abolitionist. It's a book. I can't remember the publisher, but if you Google it, I'm sure you'll find it.
It's Verso Books in the UK.
Verso is it? Yeah. It probably is in this country as well. All right, look, we've got a number of questions coming in, but what I suggest we do is let's just move the discussion on a bit, and then we'll come back, because I think a number of them are very relevant to the items we are going to discuss. So you went to New York, you did your PhD. Several years later, you published City of Disorder, and then several years on again from that, The End of Policing. And while you were doing all of that, you and more recently, you've also been very involved in sort of broader public policy work and public education, particularly through the Policing and Social Justice project, and particularly for in areas of policing schools and those kinds of issues, gang suppression policing. So just tell us a little bit about that work and how it connects with maybe your scholarly work, because I think you're kind of unusual in the sense that you're not just a scholar, you're also a kind of a public educator and someone who's kind of trying to do things in a very concrete way to foster change.
So, after I wrote City of Disorder, which is really an urban book about the rise of quality of life politics, I tried to be more involved in public policy debates in the States around policing. But after 9/11 in 2001, there really wasn't any space to do that. There was a kind of shutting down of any critical research or critical social movements around policing. And it got so, you couldn't get any research money, you couldn't get people to cooperate with research. So I actually, for a while, I moved to South Korea and worked on international policing. I was attached to a riot squad for 6 months in Seoul and lectured at the National Police University, wrote some reports for them, and went to a lot of international policing conferences and worked with, and really, and published in the more technical policing journals, Policing in Society, Police Practice and Research, that kind of stuff. And even worked on quantitative modeling with some people, et cetera. But then, there started to be this resurgence of conversation about mass incarceration, and I felt like I wanted to get more involved in American public policy. So I got involved in drug law reform in New York State, which had some of the harshest mandatory minimum drug law sentencing efforts. So we had the Drop the Rock campaign, the Rockefeller drug laws. And basically, my background, as we mentioned before, academia was in public policy. So I always knew that I wanted to try to marry public policy and academic research in some meaningful way. And the Policing and Social Justice Project is really a public policy shop rather than a primary research shop. We've gotten money to fund public policy interventions, writing reports, working with community-based organizations, advising local governments, and these kinds of things. So I feel like my role has been to stay on top of the literature. I review manuscripts for half a dozen different publishers, constantly reading stuff and trying to mobilize that in the public policy conversations. I'm a tenured full professor, so I have the luxury of being able to operate in that public policy field with a high degree of academic freedom and freedom from the necessity of focusing on very narrow peer-reviewed publications. I did that for a while. I kind of had my chops, earned my bones, as they say. And now, that's what made it possible for me to write a book like The End of Policing, where if I was going up for tenure at Columbia or Oxford or what, would probably not even be considered a legitimate publication because it's not an academic press, it's not a normal peer review process. So I think, for junior scholars, you have to get that academic security in place. But then I feel like you have some obligation to be part of a broader public conversation about these issues.
So imagine that some of the academics, British-based academics, listening when you talk about tenured professor and not having to worry about playing the the peer review journal article game, will be sitting there going, if only, So I think it's a very different situation.
It's such a trap, right? Because while I try to read a lot of that stuff, and some of it is very interesting, so much of it is just about producing the idea of academic research that is only consumed by a very small number of people in the same field, and we just see the divergence so often between the critical discourse in the academic literature and public policy. When Todd Clear was head of the American Society of Criminology about 15, 20 years ago, he said, I've been the field of criminology for 30 years has been saying that prisons are a terrible public policy intervention. They don't work, they're harmful. And every one of those 30 years, incarceration rates increased. And his thing was, if you're really, this was a lecture to graduate students, he was like, if you're really concerned about changing these things, you might want to consider a career in organizing, because these are political problems and no amount of peer-reviewed research seems to have any impact on these public policy conversations.
Interesting.
Cynical, it's a sad, somewhat cynical reading, but this is a guy at the top of the field.
Yes. We may well come back towards the end about just sort of your advice for others kind of wanting to sort of work in this area to maximum effect. But within the Policing and Social Justice Project, I think one of the areas that you've done work around is about policing and policing schools, which has been, I think, quite a significant issue, certainly in the UK, and particularly recently there was the case of Child Q that most of the audience won't need being reminded of what was happening there. So tell us a bit about the work that you've been doing around the whole issue of police in schools.
So it's interesting. People in the U.S., the mainstream media and the sort of political class said, well, there was all this uprising in 2020, and now it's all been discredited and it's gone away. But in fact, 40, 50 cities have eliminated their school policing programs since then. I have a big spreadsheet and work with folks nationally on this. Our project is currently involved in a campaign in Los Angeles County with some municipalities there where the parents are organizing for police-free schools. And so we've been assisting them with kind of best practices research.
And do they come to you? And
they come to me? Yeah, so they come to me because I'm out there now as a public voice on these issues, right? I have a certain kind of public platform in the mainstream media, et cetera. And so either through movement connections, or I just get an email. Sometimes I get a tweet on social media, we're working on this, can you help us? And so sometimes, I just do events for free. I've got some baseline funding that frees my time up. But then if people want to really do a report, have sustained engagement, then we try to figure out how to raise a little money. If there's overhead, staff time, et cetera, that has to be covered. So I've been jetting back and forth to Los Angeles. I was just there last month, where we released the first parts of our report that looked at a number of cities that have successfully gotten rid of their police departments, school police departments, and what they did instead, and then a menu of what could be done instead. Hire more counselors, better teachers' aides, restorative justice programs, wraparound services, community schools model. And then that is a tool that the local community can use to develop its own demands. So my philosophy is that, look, different communities have different public safety problems, different political dynamics. And so it doesn't make sense for me sitting at a desk in Brooklyn to write out the 10 demands for a mostly Black and Latino community in northern LA County. They know the local conditions. There are teachers and parents and students involved in this struggle. What I can do is give them the tools and resources so that when they make their own demands, they're informed by evidence, they're informed by examples that they might not otherwise be aware of, and that they're connected to a larger movement of people trying to figure this out.
So it's a kind of a sort of a hub and spoke model in a sense that they're not kind of, it's not an organization, it's a kind of a decentered collectivity of different campaigns and organizations who kind of connect with you and relate to you and draw on the sort of the knowledge and expertise of you and your colleagues, but develop their own kind of localized perspectives and solutions.
That's right. I think of us as a node in a movement, in a network, that we have certain specialized skills in terms of being able to do research of the existing literature and best practices in public policy. We have some, I do have an organizer on staff for especially the work we do around gangs policing here, but also our ability to communicate things effectively, our contacts in the media, so that if there's a campaign going on in some smaller community that is not linked to the New York media establishment, I can help make those linkages for them, get a reporter interested in what's going on there, co-write an op-ed with them for the local papers or for a national publication of some kind. So it's also a communications function that we play.
Okay, very interesting. Really sort of, I think very interesting as a kind of a model for how, it might be possible to do similar kind of work here, which is being done, but I think that node and network kind of model.
I keep a lot of data spreadsheets, a lot of spreadsheets and Google Docs. So if someone says, I'm concerned about alternatives to mental health policing, I can send them a Google Doc with resources, contacts, things like that.
Okay, interesting. Time is always against us in these programs, and we've only got about 15 minutes left, and we still have loads to get through. So let's just pick up on some current issues. And you mentioned Tasers earlier, so let's just pick up specifically. There's a couple of questions Taser related. One from anonymous attendee raising concerns about possibly armed volunteers as a proposal that special constables who effectively volunteer police in this country might be armed with tasers, and what's going on there. And there's also a question here from Deb Coles. In the UK, we're seeing increased police powers and rollout of tasers, and ongoing scandal of deaths after lethal force by police officers, and particularly impacting on Black people. What advice do you have for moving this debate into policing in the political arena? So, I think you've already sort of covered some of that in your remarks, but do you have some more maybe to say about that, particularly in the context of tasers and racialized policing, which I know is...
Well, this is obviously, as you might imagine, I think this is a terrible idea. The argument in the US was that if we introduce tasers, this will reduce the number of shootings. And so it's a harm reduction strategy. But that's not what's happened. The number of police killings has not gone down. It remains over 1,000 a year. What we've seen is a dramatic increase in the use of tasers. So in situations where officers might have put their hands on someone or used pepper spray, they now go straight to the taser, rather than it being a replacement for the use of the handgun. So in the UK, you're not even trying to replace the handguns. All you're doing is expanding the potentially lethal use of force of people. So this can only result, in my opinion, in significant increases in use of force. And there are really deep criticisms of Axon, the company that the new name of the company that owns the taser, right? A lot of research about faking of their research, faking of safety data. People are being killed by tasers on a regular basis. And so I think this is a really terrible development. It represents a kind of public policy failure. which is that there's this growing feeling of insecurity. And rather than addressing it through social policy interventions to stabilize people's income security, housing security, et cetera, we're just going to introduce more violence into the public arena.
And I mean, it's really interesting how, as you mentioned, the British police, although actually there are increasingly armed police in Britain on a routine basis, but traditionally not. And I think what's interesting about the debate about tasers here is a lot of the time the argument is, no, this isn't about harm reduction. This is about protecting police officers. It's about giving them an extra tool in the arsenal so that if they're faced with a threatening situation, you know, the assailant with the knife, you know, for example, that they can maintain distance and they can safely bring a potential dangerous confrontation or to a managed conclusion without anybody, including the police officer, getting hurt. So what do you make of that argument?
Here's three mistakes that people make in these situations, in my opinion. Whenever they imagine either a technological fix or just the idea that some new policing intervention is going to fix a problem. One is that they grossly overestimate the effectiveness of the intervention, right? They just imagine that a new tool will mean new effectiveness, but this is not at all clear in this case. Tasers really don't function that well. Heavy clothing, all kinds of things interfere with their effectiveness. Second, they fail to calculate the costs. So they'll say, well, if we save one police officer's life, then it's worth it. And maybe they'll carry out some kind of narrow financial cost, right? Well, how do we cost out the life of a police officer? You know, but tasers are very expensive, but there are all kinds of other costs. What about the thousands of non-lethal use of force uses of tasers, right? That is a cost on society. What about the cost to the reputation of policing? That now police are associated with tasing people all the time. That is going to color every future interaction between police and the public, in my view, right? You've introduced this new higher level use of violence as a routine part of policing. But what if we save one police officer, but in the process, 3 or 4 people are killed by the taser use? How do we measure the cost effectiveness of that, right? So how do we measure the cost of the ideological effect of saying the way we deal with the growing insecurity of British society is to introduce more violence into the equation? So those costs are never considered in these kinds of situations. And the third mistake people make is they fail to consider alternatives. So if we're concerned about officer safety, a taser is really the only way we could approach this problem. Now, I don't know the details about what produces bad safety outcomes for officers in the UK. I know a fair amount about the US. One thing we could do is quit sending police on traffic stops. This would save a lot of police lives, a lot more than the introduction of tasers ever will. We could quit using police on mental health crisis calls. This is also a major source of danger for police, right? So there are a lot of things we could be doing to make officer safety improve other than giving them more tools of violence.
And that last point relates to one of the other questions in our Q&A from Charlotte, who says, do you have an alternative model for confrontation in the community in the US or elsewhere? And I think, you know, the example of dealing with sort of those in mental health crisis, I guess, is a classic example of that. Is there a model, or is it more? Well,
yeah. So, but you know, between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. These are very potentially volatile situations. And the police have said, well, see, all that violence proves there has to be police involved, even though it's the violence being carried out by police. So it turns out this just isn't true. What we've seen, another outcome of the 2020 era, has been a growing number of cities that are developing non-police crisis response teams, hiring mental health workers, outreach workers, EMS workers to go on these calls instead. So Denver was one of the first cities to implement this, their STARS program. They're diverting a huge number of emergency calls. They have not requested police assistance a single time in a year of this program. It's been so successful that they're dramatically expanding it, and it's becoming a model for cities across the country. Major cities like Houston, I mean, Denver is a major city here as well, San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, New York is rolling out a pilot version of this. The details matter, they're different models, but we can send someone other than armed police to handle these things. And these interventions work best when they're combined with the creation of new community level services, so that there's a place to take someone other than jail or hospitals. And of course, this is exactly the problem the UK is facing. You have this obligation to take someone to a place of safety, but the places of safety are being cut back because of budget cuts, and the burden is falling increasingly on policing. And as a result, more deaths in custody, more use of force, and more demands for things like tasers.
Interesting. You mentioned Denver and some other US cities, and I guess something that was very much in the public eye a few years ago with the events in Minneapolis and the murder of George Floyd. And following that, there was a big pressure on the local city to effectively disband the police or do something quite radical about Minneapolis police. And I think there's been some quite interesting developments there in the intervening years, haven't there?
Well, it's very complicated, and we won't be able to go through all the details, but I think the victories were overstated at the beginning, and that was driven really by politicians, not the community-based movements. But also the demise of those efforts has been greatly exaggerated. What we have seen is significant new investments in Minneapolis in alternative public safety infrastructures and concrete efforts to reduce the scope of policing, to get them out of traffic enforcement, out of schools, out of even things like gun violence reduction, and instead hire school counselors and community-based anti-violence specialists and social work outreach teams, and to improve community level services. So the community-based movements had pretty concrete demands, and it wasn't tomorrow we're going to abolish the police department. It was like, we want this money transferred, we want these kinds of programs created, and that actual agenda is moving forward. And we continue to see very progressive people elected to the city council there who are trying to figure this out. And it's going to take time. I don't think anyone who's really doing this kind of organizing on the ground in the States thinks that we're going to win these victories in a year or two. This is a process of community building and long-term transformation.
So is there a kind of a sort of a tension there between, as it were, on the ground community organizers and people who really understand their patch and are connected in with other community groups and have a maybe sort of quite a pragmatic but practical vision, and maybe sort of activists who are more kind of informed by a high level, kind of maybe slightly abstract critique, that the police are bad and we just need to abolish them? Is there, do you find those?
There's potential for that. There's always potential for that. And we can all point to some bad examples where something like that has happened. What we, especially in a time of crisis, of high levels of protest, what I mostly see happening right now is a tremendous amount of coalition building at the local level, of people trying to figure this out, of trying to emphasize the importance of those community-based struggles, that we're not going to win this because we had the most militant protest. The militant protests are important for creating a sense of political possibility, but the real victories are going to come when struggles like the one in LA County to get police out of the schools is run by parents and teachers and students. with the assistance of people who can provide expertise, can provide material support, who can provide political cover, media attention, right? We need to figure out how to work together on these things.
We're nearly out of time, and I want to come in a minute to just any advice you might have for those who would like to work in this area. Before we do so, there's a question here from Leela. I think it's Leela. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name. If the police is an arm of the state essential to the functioning of a liberal democracy, what kind of systemic overhaul do we need, and what are the practical steps we can start taking to get there?
In 30 seconds.
Yeah, in 30 seconds. Yeah.
So that's chapter 2. That's chapter 2 of the book. I think we need to rethink what we mean by a liberal democracy. We need to undermine this idea that police exist to enforce a system of laws that benefit everyone equally. You know, policing exists to reproduce and maintain systems of exploitation. And that has always been their role. And we need to, and that is at the core of any kind of abolitionist analysis, is this problematizing of systems of punitive coercion as being, you know, a legitimate state function. So that's a longer conversation. Maybe you could have Mark Neoclose on to talk about his work about how police fabricate social order. It's wonderful stuff.
We've had 2 or 3 suggestions for future guests, including Mark and also Derek Purnell. So these are all great. Thank you very much. And look, before we finish, we always like to finish with a question about, you know, any advice or guidance you might have for, you know, students maybe who are currently studying policing and criminal justice issues, maybe those who'd like to get involved in some form of activism or advocacy work. And so what would your advice be in terms of
get out in the community? Get out in the community. Quit making the center of your research agenda the criminal justice institutions, because they capture the point of view, right? Then it becomes how to make them more effective, more efficient, more legitimate. And I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in producing safe and healthy communities. And to do that, we need to understand what's happening at the community. And we need to think much more holistically than just how do we improve policing.
Lovely answer. Thank you very much. Alex, it's been an absolute delight catching up with you on Zoom. And, you know, I think it's been a fascinating discussion. We have recorded this event, so we will be putting it on the YouTube channel. And I for one, will certainly want to rewatch it and just reflect on what you were saying. It's very rich and, you know, and deep in insight and understanding. So thank you very much.